this is a poem called Reading. It mentions just all these poets you may or may not have heard of. Wang Wei, a Chinese poet, Allen Ginsberg, and who else? Yeats, of course, the Irish poet. Just how when you read a poem or a book, sometimes that can become your whole world. You inhabit it sometimes. Reading. That was the year I rented an apartment inside the poems of Wang Wei. His lines about cassia blossoms falling were a window I looked out from as city buses downshifted on Headman Avenue. In the afternoons, I went to my job inside the poem Howl by Allen Ginsberg. All summer, I walked the corridors of his long sentences. In autumn, the weather turned cold, and the newspaper began talking about the Super Bowl and the presidential election. Wang Wei's poems died on the branch and fell to the ground. We raked them into piles. And a few weeks later, the world was covered in the cold, beautiful poems of Yeats. Here's an office poem. Oh boy, offices. Some people have been in offices. I've been in offices. We're not in one now. If you've never been in one in a job-like way, you're a bird floating free above the rest of us. So this is from Temping in New York City. I wrote this little poem. It's called Days of Glory. Another day with Jan, smiter of barbarians. Another morning with Bob, pillager of cities. Another workday with Carol, ravager of nations. As I walk to the water cooler, I see the shimmer of our grandiosity on the walls. I feel the 100 auras of our magnificence gathered around us like the walls of a great city. We are rare and terrible. We are lush and splendid in the jungles of our excellence. But if someday I find that I am only Harold, sender of emails, and that my companions are only Debbie, clearer of paper jams, and Philip, slurper of coffee, then still I will be able to look back on our days of glory, even if they were not days but only minutes, and those minutes did not in fact happen at all. Still I will own the green source of my strength and power, which is the memory of my days with Carol, ravager of nations, with Bob, pillager of cities, and with Jan, smiter of barbarians. This is a poem called Tinnitus. I like calling it tinnitus, but it's pronounced tinnitus, so there we go. It's about the squealing in your ears you get when you've heard a lot of loud music or you're getting older or whatever. So I did play a lot of loud music when I was younger, not a kid, younger. So this is a poem about that. I guess it's kind of there's some poets in the audience, maybe all of us are poets. It's kind of an exercise in how many things can you compare one thing to, kind of, perhaps. Tinnitus. It's the squeal in my head of all the guitar riffs I ever unloaded into the air. Songs pressed so thin I can barely hear them, but I barely hear them all the time. A screeching residue from my days of wail and flail, what I get for turning the knob to 10. It rings like shiny things, like stainless steel or glimmers of light on car fenders, like bright spoons and mirrors or a spotlight glaring off a suit of armor. If only I'd been wearing a suit of armor, or a helmet of cork, if I'd fired up that amplifier by remote control from a concrete bunker 8 blocks away. Now this inexhaustible sand in the shoes of my listening. They say it's the little hairs of my inner ear broken off, weed-whacked, zapped like the tops of trees by summer lightning. I blame myself. I blame Thomas Edison. I blame the lack of elders in mud huts chanting red medicine to the cornflower moon. I hear it most in the sea-deep silences of the far forest, an extra bug-like whine beneath the leafy murmur. Like some dirtball punk rocker I once knew who has smuggled himself into my future, a reeking stowaway from those nights when I was the power cord overlord in a basement crowded with mic stands and wires. Regrets? Sorrow? Don't look back is the most rockin' philosophy, but it stays, it rings and sings like a fire alarm keening inside a star. I'm pierced, I'm needled, I'm prickled and sung, and it seems this limitless aria needs my head to whistle in, that the unshaven angel, whose music is a dog whistle multiplied by the square root of a house on fire, has chosen my skull for his amphitheater. Faithful companion, screeching wind, inner tattoo, unshakable hitchhiker in the big rig of the mind. I leave it behind, but it does not leave me behind. 2 more. This is a Mother Goose type of a poem. You know Mother Goose. Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. The little dog laughed to see such fun, and the dish ran away with the spoon. There we go. So I have a daughter, and you encounter Mother Goose rhymes and things like that when you have a child. So I just sort of expanded this little rhyme into 4 parts here. So this is the first section, the cat and the fiddle. Claws scrambling up the fingerboard, whiskers on chin rest, a caterwaul of melody agreeing to fill and filigree the air, with sharps like burrs in a sweater and flats like skippering gray stones. Midsummer night, and this mad cat just sawing away, tail thumping to the rhythm, first idle then intent, angry like the tail itself was going to run off and toss pots through windows. And all the while this melody up top like a fern uncurling, a green arabesque finding its shape where none had been before. Call it a divertimento, a reel, some tawny etude cast all the way back to the scratchless past when every yowl was just a purr. Afterwards only the lush hush of evening, stars set out on the sky's table, and one stray bowhair drifting into the grass. Now we get the cow jumping over the moon. So this porcelain-colored bovine, splotchy with muted browns and whites like water stains on maps, springs, clean as a gear, loosed from a clock, up, out, and over, with the big, white, ancient, seen-it-all rock hanging there like a drop of paint below her udder and hooves and dangling tail, the moon. And what ratio of body mass to velocity? What alignment of muscle tone and angle of ascent? What dew-kissed manual of barnyard aeronautical maneuvers is it to which this stunt is the proof? A hop, a jump, a startled moo curdling the air. She came to ground soon after. And the little dog laughed. I'd never heard a dog laugh. I'm not sure I did then, but there was a bark, surely, then another, then a sound like 4 or 5 of them heaped up on top of one another. Rough stacked on rough, or was it woof? A warble? Did he cough because he wanted to sing? Could you call it a laugh? A sneeze? Some mistake in the face all dogs present to humans? A gladsome glitch in the ancient subservience? Dunno. I turned to look, but he just sat there. And then the dish runs away with a spoon. This is kind of a police report. Circular as a voyage, it comes back to its start, officer. Round as a wheel of extra sharp cheddar and about yay big. That's what my dish looked like. And no, I didn't see them go. I didn't catch sight of their escape or elopement or whatever it is you want to call it, though I was there, sure, in the next room, just sitting down to microwave popcorn and a cold beer, when there came this clatter amid the kitchenware, this ruckus near the cabinetry, and then the door banging in what, I see now, was unintended farewell, because look, there's a bare place in my cupboard, 7 plates where once there were 8, and in the drawer, I've got knife, fork, and, oh, most edgeless one, most innocent and least weapon-like, funhouse friendly, though, I gotta say, always a trifle warped. Nothing but an empty place where the spoon once sang. She rhymes. So, here's a poem. This is a longer one, the last poem. It's called Cadman's Hymns. Cadman, anybody? Cadman, who's Cadman? We don't know. So that's like the first.
He was a friend of Dayor.
Oh, Dayor. Oh, that's a whole other poem we got it right. Maybe even that one. Cadman, he was like, it's like the first poem in the English language, people say. And it's a poem and there's a story about it. That he's a fellow, there's a monastery in Whitby in England, and there's monks up there, and there's farmhands who care for the land. And Cadman is one of those farmhands, and they sing every night. They pass a harp around and they sing. But Cadman's always one who says, no, I don't sing, I'll see you later. And he goes and sleeps in the barn with the animals. This is the legend as it is. But one night Cadman has a dream. A man comes to him in a dream and says, Cadman, sing me something. He says, I can't sing. Wakes up in the morning and suddenly he can sing. And he sings all these marvelous songs on biblical themes. This is how the story goes. The Venerable Bede wrote this story down. So the monks test him. This comes from God, they all think. And so they give him these themes to write about. And he makes up all these songs about the stories in the Bible. So this is kind of, in some ways, the founding myth of English poetry. It's the oldest English poem we have, even though it's kind of a territorial thing to call it an Old English poem, because it's like Latin is Old Italian, right? Because it sounds like, well, it sounds like Nushul and Harry and Haven reaches where, Methodus merfe and his modia funk. It sounds like that. So, that's a Germanic language. It's Old English, but now we can't really understand it. So I just like that story. It's a very cool story. And it says he wrote many poems on biblical themes. We only have the one poem he wrote, which is about the world being created. So I wrote a poem just imagining him and imagining the other poems he would have sung about different biblical themes. And so that's the outline here. Cadman's Hymns, this is called. He was just a stable boy, ragged and mud-spattered in his clothes, and evenings when the monks would gather in the high-raftered hall of the monastery for onion soup, afterwards passing a small harp from one to the other, each of them offering a song up into the candlelit air, he would always refuse, saying he knew no music and that he had no song. And as their voices rose, blossoming above the long table strewn with wooden bowls, he'd slip away, out the kitchen door, taking the bracken-edged trail across the field to the hayloft of the barn, where silence was dark water, and he could sleep close to the goats he cared for, the complaint in their voices nagging him awake hours before dawn to sit blinking in the cold, blue air. So day followed day, drifts of fog hiding the monastery with its garden and tower, and then revealing it again, the thread of his silence woven into the tapestry of sparrow songs and vespers, and always just over the cliff edge of the sea. But one night, as he lay in the thicket of a dream, a light flared over him, and he looked up to see a woman dressed in fire, who with words of blossom and star asked him to sing. And he awoke and shook the dream off, and his hand reached for the milk pail as always. But on this morning, when the early monk came with whispering steps across the dew-soaked grass, when he creaked the barn door open to collect milk for the morning meal, Cadman answered his greeting with a song containing the history of the universe. From the first waters pooled in darkness to the bright word of light cast into waves crashing at the edges of islands, soon become home to sparrows nesting amid the peach trees in gardens bordering the log houses of the first town. Honeybees droning through the branches of an old oak there, and under it a soldier carving a toy horse for a boy as a fat woman wrings the neck of a chicken, sunlight splashing around her as she settles onto a wooden stool to pluck the feathers out, and in the farmhouse behind her, darkness in the pots. And the monk stumbled dizzy out of the hum of that music to tell the abbot of the miracle. And later that day, the bearded abbot and the choir master too both came to the barn, the wooden crosses around their necks dangling straight down as they sat on milk stools leaning forward to hear. And Cadman sang to them about Jesus' sister, hidden from the Romans, who after his death rode the broad-backed tiger of her anger far into the desert, where in the rhythms of sand and wind she was able to remember tenderness and the abandonment of desire. And he sang about the red ladder Job built in the blind stupor of his grief, that years later remained where he'd left it, leaning against nothing, standing sun-scoured and bristling with crows amid the ashen wreck and powder of what had once been his orange trees. And of the dictionary makers of Babel, to whom language also was a prideful thing in which death itself could be conjugated past fire and ash to become a muddy shore covered in footprints which the waters of the tide rose daily to claim. And now every morning the choir master would come and ask Cadman to sing. And often a scribe was there also, a man scratching at parchment in the corner of the barn, hurrying to catch what bright birds of thought and melody he could to set them roosting as black marks on a page. Weeks went by, chorusing into months, until a day came when Cadman entered the monastery to speak to a monk about a sick goat, and he saw on a table a pile of calf skins that had been scraped and dried, each one crowded with thin red lines and boxes, marks like tiny leaves of spiraling knots of black string. And he asked the monk what sort of pictures were there, and the man gave a laugh as one gives to children and said, "Why, those are your songs, Cadman." And Cadman looked and said nothing. And that night, as every night, after supper, they asked him for a song, and he took the harp up in his hands that by now seemed like a shell smoothed and polished by the waters of his voice, and he sang to them about Adam and Eve, how they were grown gray-haired, and of the day in autumn when two of their grandchildren, a boy and a girl, came rushing into the house, babbling about the overgrown garden they had found in the far woods. And how fearful in their bones they returned to the place of their first shame to find only withered trees covered in lichens, pale mushrooms thrusting up out of a dead oak, broken and squirrel-chewed chestnut shells which their granddaughter gathered happily into the valleys of her dress. And as the monks in their robes sat listening amid empty bowls and candles guttering out, Cadman sang further, even to the tree itself, vine-tormented as it was, though heavy with apples, which first Eve and then Adam too snapped from the branches, biting into them, finding there no burning law to scorch their tongues, but only the sharp tang of autumn. Rose-colored clouds drifting in over the trees, crickets beginning to call. And it was then they heard a flittering dazzle of yellow and orange trilling from a branch, though at a shout from the boy it flickered away to leave them there listening, stock still as though by stillness they could summon that beauty back. And as Cadman's voice faded into the corners of the hall, the listening of the monks went on, so that slowly each of them became aware of the distant sound of the sea, the thump and murmur of it seeming to enter the hall, making of it a single eloquence which they hardly dared disturb with a breath. And if a miracle is water, then like water it must spill and slacken and trickle away. And if it is a rope of breath, or a mirror of birds, or a squall of light so blinding as to etch the dirt with the long shadows of ants, then still this miracle must vanish, for this is not a world of miracles. Even years later, there were a few who remembered, and even some of the monks tried now and then to convince Cadman to sing again, but he always refused, for his voice now was a soaring without feathers, without music, without wings. But it was the scribe who was most haunted, the man who had sat in the corner of the barn with a freshly cut goose quill in his hand as the dream river poured past him. And though it was not every day, still often enough while hoisting well water in a clattering bucket up out of darkness, or while chopping onions, he'd find himself swept away, standing at the cutting board, staring at the rough plaster of the wall before him, and seeing nothing but the lichen-covered trees and withered leaves of the garden Cadman's song had once melodied into air. And as the half-cut onions leaked their juices into the cutting board, he'd remember again how the late light in that garden had reached between the darkening maples and oaks, how a yellow leaf had tumbled down onto a log furred with moss, or how Adam's little grandson had cradled a dead cricket in his hands, the black sheen of it echoing his eyes. So it's pretty interesting because the monks wrote down his songs and then lost all of them except for one we have. So it's the beginning of poetry in English, but it's many people feel that Cadman was probably a bard trained in a pagan tradition that the monks would have been hostile towards. And so he gave them this biblical song, but he quite possibly had many others in a pagan tradition that then ended. So it's the beginning of written poetry in English. It's the end of oral tradition in some ways. Anyway, so my daughter, come to think of it, I might as well bring her into this. I told her this story, and I set that poem to music, and it's become her bedtime song. I've probably sung it 1,000 times, and I'll just give it to you now as well. Because, yeah, I like the music of words, and I've been drawn to the place where poetry and song come together. And that is one of the places is in Cadman's life. So here is that song. So this is my setting of that poem, because it is a song. We don't know what it sounded like, but who knows? Nu shillen Harry, even reach us wet. Nato des mukta and if moja fan. Wark wilder fader, swahe wunderaya wes. Eja drift and ora sailor. Eres shall peel the bed on heaven to rova. Ali ship and damit in Headman. Unes wet. Eja drift and after tail down. And het moja thang, wark wilder faders, wahe wonder I wes, eja drift and ora sailor. Eres shall peel the bell, heaven to rova, ali shiz and damit in Headman, unes wes, eja drift and after tail down. another song. Like I said, I've been drawn to where song and poetry come together. Another place and a time is in the poetry of Rumi from the Middle East, who wrote many of his poems while after hours of chanting and spinning and singing all kinds of things. So I've taken a poem of his and set that to music, and my accomplices and friends are going to sing that with me. So the only technology we need are three other chairs. We're going to get some chairs. What's that? Oh, you got chairs. All right, cool. So come on up. These are my friends Noah, Liz, and Mike, who are, surprised and excited to be part of a poetry experience, I can tell. So this is a poem of Rumi's. It's on his tomb. In Persian, it's Baza, Baza, Harancha Hasti Baza, Gar Kafiro Gavro, Bot Farasti Baza, Inda Gekimo da Gekino Midinist, Shud Baraga Tobas, Shu Kasti Baza. I don't speak Persian, but I've sought out people from there and tried to learn how it sounds, because it's fun to get into the language. It means, come whoever you are, this is not a house of despair. If you've broken your vow 1,000 times, we don't care. Lover of leaving, oh doubtful one, come whoever you are, come and yet again come. The phrase Baza means come or welcome in Persian. The actual poem has been changed a little bit. He says, lover of leaving, and then he lists all the religions like Christian, Muslim, Zoroastrian, whoever you are, come on in. That was kind of long to fit into the lyrics, so I just said, oh, doubtful one, because, we're pretty doubtful around here, me included. And so that's what we've done with it. So we're just going to let this roll and see what happens. All right, okay.